What's this one? What's this one?
7.
Got it.
I think there's a lot of doors open in this school. Yeah. All right, here we go. So let's go. And then if anybody else comes, if not, I don't care. They don't, I don't. All right. So what's that? Before we get to anything, real fast.
Can I go first?
No. Yes, you're first. No throwing things at me. Number 1. First thing, don't forget when you have the essays, the DBQ, the long essay, even the short answer question, do a quick brainstorm list. Especially before you read the documents, do a brainstorm list. Don't just start reading the documents because you won't get any context. Just jot down a few things, get as many things as you can, so your mind is in that area, so you start thinking in context. If you're not thinking in context, it would just be words. And so make sure you do that. That's why I said, when we did that last one, you'll do the brainstorm first. And try to think of anything in that era. It'll bring back some memories. Next, do the same thing with the short IDs or short answer questions. Think of a few things, especially if you're not sure. You might, hopefully there'll be a couple you know. But, there might be one you're not sure about. Go back and think about it. And what do you do? Do you have enough food? Where's the burger from? Okay. Where's the rest of our burgers? Okay, so with that, and just make sure you go through it. Make sure you get a few things down. If I had my iPad, it'd follow me. But this one, I don't think my phone. I should have my iPad.
It follows you?
Yeah, the camera will follow you wherever you go.
That's really creepy.
And then it'll also, if you walk around it, it'll switch camera size and follow you that side.
That is really, really
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I don't film it.
I call that.
All right, so, but don't forget to do that. What time do you have to be there? And most of you are fine. If you're here, you're fine. I'm looking around. I got everyone who's here. And so I'm going to go through as many as these as I can. I'm thinking the last half. So page, you can do 8, but 9, 10, you all the way through the end. First question. Read, what is it?
Confidence, page 10.
Oh, confidence. And that is the whole issue about confidence about crashes. When there's a boom, everyone's confident. Banks are loaning money like mad. Everyone's investing. Everybody trusts everybody else's assets for collateral. But in a panic, confidence crashes. Banks don't loan anymore. And in a bad depression, like the Great Depression, people lose faith, first off, in themselves. They blame themselves for being unemployed. They begin to lose faith in the government. Remember Hoovervilles, those shanty towns? And then the biggie, people begin to lose faith in the system. And that's where you get growth of like in Germany, that's when fascism came in because of the Great Depression and that, and like socialism. Is there another one? Any other ones? Yes.
Vertical trust.
On page?
Page 8.
Yeah, that's all a company that owns all the means of production.
Sorry, what did he say?
Page 8, Vertical Trust. And so they own all, like Carnegie Steel. He owned the mines, or controlled the mines, the mills, the railroads, the actual steel mills, and distribution. So that's a form of monopoly and or form of trust. Yes.
The social contract is like the blank box at the top of page
3.
3.
Okay, I'm going to focus more on pages 9 through, but I'll answer that really quick. That's John Locke's idea for that governments are there to protect rights. If they don't protect rights, we should replace them. And that's why Jefferson would justify the Declaration of Independence. That's what page 16, conservative backlash. And that's going to be a backlash against, you really start seeing it against the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-war movement, the more kind of permissive society that seem to be going on. So this very conservative backlash. And also a big backlash because we lost in Vietnam, so we thought the communists were winning the Cold War. And another big backlash was the massive increase in gas prices. 400% increase, 2 different times. And so there's big inflation, and so conservatives could say, see, Keynesian doesn't work. And this conservative backlash would lead to Reagan, trickle-down economics that we've had. Basically, it's changing a little bit, but we still basically have. Yes, sir. Okay, that's mobilization for World War I, and that's mobilization for World War II. And mobilization for World War I, that's basically total war. The entire economy is mobilized for war. But there's also one more thing about mobilization. Mobilization is calling out your reserves, and whoever mobilizes first can attack first, and that was the German plan in the Schlieffen plan. It almost worked. But the United States created a bunch of war boards to manage production during World War I to mobilize the economy, and it failed miserably. They did much better in World War II. Yes, Chris. Social issues, page 16. And that was something that Richard Nixon really began to hammer on, the idea that liberals were more permissive and lead to a more permissive society. Everything from women's rights and allowing women to divorce and out of bad marriages, things like that, but also the civil rights movement, and blaming Democrats for increased drugs, rock and roll music. And it was quite effective. This is where he said that he called them either the great silent majority or the forgotten Americans. That's what he called them. And so Reagan, that would be part of, Reagan would use it in 1980, and it's still used right now. So it's really effective political play. Yes. Not really, no. Even though he got divorced. No, that was, but Reagan did sign a law in California about that. Yeah. National Origins Act on page where? Page 10, National Origins Act. That's a culmination of the nativism of that era, and this was the most racist time in history, and a culmination of Red Summer and the Red Scare, with the idea that they have to stop dangerous immigrants. So the National Origins Act would limit immigrants, put quotas on immigrants, I guess is a better way to put it, and from all over the world, and severely restrict immigrants that aren't from Northern Europe. So it was very racially oriented. So basically no immigrants from Asia, no immigrants from Southern Europe. And that was part of the nativism, racism. That would be the law until 1968. Yeah.
Page 16, teen culture.
The what?
Teen culture.
Oh, 1968 teen culture. And the big thing about that was you could start seeing the 50s and 60s, because people were more affluent than ever before. Teens had more money than ever before. And so companies would market to them, music would market to teenagers, and that accelerated or increased the generation gap. And so, but that's the big thing. Once they started marketing them, and so then, you know, like it could be the kids, like rock and roll became their music. And then that spread off to, basically, perhaps drug use or that kind of thing, called counterculture. Yes?
Warren Court.
Warren Court on page 14?
It's the same page.
So I'm close. On page 14, the Warren Court is that's 16. The Warren Court is the liberal court, Earl Warren, who was Chief Justice appointed by Eisenhower, and no court was made more rulings to promote civil rights. And the 2 cases we mentioned in class were Brown versus Board of Education and Griswold versus Connecticut. Remember, Griswold versus Connecticut was privacy rights and abortion rights, but also things like the Miranda decision that said people had to be read their rights if they are arrested. Have you ever heard that? You have the right to remain silent. That's from the Miranda decision. And The Vallejo decision said that mandatory school prayer was unconstitutional, things like that. So that'd be the 50s and 60s.
Huey Long,
Huey Long, what page?
page 10.
Huey Long, page 10. He was known as the Kingfish, the governor, then senator of Louisiana, and he ran Louisiana. And he thought Roosevelt wasn't going far enough, and he had a share our wealth plan, basically to confiscate money from millionaires and give everybody a homestead, $5,000 and $1,000 a year. And he was looking like, so he said the New Deal wasn't going far enough for working people. He threatened a third-party run, but will be assassinated in 1935. So he was an example of opposition to Roosevelt. Yes.
Also on page 10, the Creel Commission.
Creel Commission, that's the propaganda arm in World War I for the United States to promote social unity. And so they're the ones who did things like a 4-minute man who did little 4-minute speeches, did all the propaganda. They're the ones who convinced people to hate and fear the Germans, and that's going to lead to war madness. Remember I told you about, like, they started calling dachshunds victory pups and things like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Government action and federal reserve.
Say it again. Government action, tariff, Federal Reserve.
Action, tariff, Federal Reserve.
Oh, I needed something to trigger my memory. That's one of the causes of the Great Depression. And so government action is the government did not raise interest rates to stop the bubble that led to the crash. And then they were slow to lower it when the crash came. There was no safety net at all, so no kind of welfare or unemployment insurance or anything like that. And then in 1930, they passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which increased tariffs, which led to a trade war, which killed trade. So the government in 1931-30 made the Depression worse. I forgot one more thing. And austerity. In 1932, austerity, which is the government began to cut spending at a time when nobody was buying anything, and it just killed the remaining demand. That's why the winter of 32 was the worst. Same thing happened in Germany and led to Hitler. Yes. So on page 14, LBJ's reason for war. His biggest reason was he wanted to save the Great Society. So he felt he had to be tough on communism to get civil rights passed. Remember, the big issue was the Voting Rights Act when he sent troops. But he wanted his Great Society and all his programs. His other reasons were, it was JFK's legacy. JFK said the war, he sent American advisors there, and he was worried to be accused of losing the war, losing JFK's war. And lastly, credibility. If we're going to be a credible defense in Berlin, we need to be a credible defense in South Vietnam. Oh, I should add one thing. And of course, it failed miserably. He hit it and it would destroy the Great Society. My Lai on page 14. That would come out in 1969, but it happened in 68. And it was the biggest of over 120 court-martials for war crimes by American soldiers in South Vietnam. And My Lai was a massacre. A company of U.S. troops massacred between 300 and 500 South Vietnamese civilians in My Lai. And it was payback for an American soldier who was killed. They were furious. They wanted revenge. And it would become a massive issue during the war. It was covered up. And then the person who committed it would be court-martialed, the officer in charge, Lieutenant Calley, C-A-L-L-E-Y. He was pardoned by Nixon. And Nixon used this as a wedge issue against the anti-war movement. You would not have believed how many people came out to say Calley did the right thing. They should have killed them all. Wow, was the war divisive. Yeah. On page 14. Oh, say it again, which one? Détente. Détente. Détente is the lessening of tensions with the Soviet Union under Nixon. Same thing happened under President Ford and Carter. And the first time ever SALT 1 was passed, and that was the first arms limitation stop. And we have people who aren't even in the class here. That is pretty amazing. But it was the first arms limitation, and Nixon, who was the Cold Warrior, actually had some limit or some arms control. It would all blow up at the end of the decade, and we nearly blow the world up. Well, not we, but the Soviets about blew us all up in 1983. That was a close one. Yeah, go. Say it again. On page 14. Paris Peace Talks, that's what ended the Vietnam War. And Nixon scuttled the original Paris Peace Talks in 68. So the war went on for another 4 years. And finally in 73, a peace talk that actually North Vietnam got a better deal in 73 than they would have in 68. That gives you how bad, 20,000 American deaths, 1 million Vietnamese for a worse deal. And the U.S. could pull out, claim peace with honor. The POWs came home, but it was illusionary. South Vietnam would fall shockingly fast in the last offensive, finally in 75.
Pentagon Papers.
Pentagon Papers on page 14.
Oh, yeah.
That was a secret history of the Vietnam War. That was done in basically from 45 to 68. But it was leaked in 1971. And it showed how much the administration was lying. It showed how much, before Nixon, but how much the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson's administration had lied about the war. And Nixon went nuts and created this kind of weird quasi-legal group to plug leaks. They'd be the same people who'd break into Watergate. So the Pentagon Papers would directly read to that. He called that group to plug leaks the plumbers. Get it? Hey.
What's part of the same page?
So in 1974, after Nixon resigned because he was going to get impeached because of Watergate, when the tapes came out, when the Supreme Court ruled that he must reserve the tapes for Watergate, Ford pardoned Nixon for any crime. So Nixon was never convicted. There were actually going to be 38 indictments on Richard Nixon, and they would have gotten them all. He was pardoned, and maybe it alleviated some of the divisiveness of the country. The country was so divided, but it also was telling the president, you can get away with anything. Yeah, that set a bad precedent. Go ahead. Moral majority on page 16, is that near the bottom? The moral majority was a big change in religion. A new kind of wave of fundamentalist Christian, Protestant Christians. They also called themselves the religious right. They were never really political before, but after 1976, they became very political. And the two big issues were, the big issue that started it was the Carter administration wanted to tax segregation academies, those all-white religious schools. And that was the first big reason, but that's kind of a reason. The reason that really pushed them to the Republicans would be abortion. And fundamentalist Christians became voting about 90% for Republicans. Yes, sorry. I think I put him down there for the Paris Peace Talks is trying to say that Nixon scuttled that one. I think maybe I forgot I did that. So the Paris Peace Talks was one Nixon scuttled. The Paris Peace Agreement was the one that they finally passed. So as long as you just put something in that one, I know. After looking back at it, I made it too close. But I'm sure that's what I was thinking when I did.
So what does POWs have to do with the Paris Peace Agreement?
So American POWs that were held in North Vietnam, mostly airplane crews that were shot down over North Vietnam, they were released and sent back to America. So they were being passed.
Executive Order 9,906.
On page?
Or page 12.
Page 12, that's the internment of Japanese. 1942, anybody of Japanese descent on the West Coast, so Washington, Oregon, and California. FDR signed this agreement as an executive order because of its war powers, and therefore they would be sent to concentration camps. They would be sent to concentration camps with absolutely no evidence that they were going to do, that they had done or might do anything wrong, except for the fact that they had Japanese ancestry. That's war madness. That's total war. And the Supreme Court would say, yes, the president has that power in Korematsu versus U.S. Is that right next to it? Yeah, good. Korematsu versus U.S. Yeah.
The bonus army on page 10.
Bonus Army, page 10, right in the middle. Yeah, pretty close. Two-thirds down. That's 1932 during the Hoover administration. Veterans of World War I, unemployed, desperate. They marched on Washington, D.C. to demand a small bonus for their service that was going to be due in 45. They asked for it in 32. And they held, or they basically stayed in the largest Hooverville of them all, over 10,000 people, in Washington, D.C. The House passed it, but the Senate voted it down, and then they fled in the middle of the night, Congress did. And the Army, Hoover was in command of the Army, forced them out. And the big deal about the bonus army was it showed Hoover as being uncaring about the plight of average people, including veterans of the United States, and would really be a boom then for Roosevelt to say, I'm going to help the forgotten America. Bonus army was a big deal. And don't forget, they would also use the bonus army to attempt a coup the next year. Yeah. So fundamentalism, conservatism, that's in the 1920s. And it's a different kind of fundamentalism. It was brand new in the 1920s, that term fundamentalism. But it was this idea that we've gone too far, either by technology or giving women the right to vote, or fighting against prohibition. But one of the biggies are all these new technological devices. And so the new fundamentalist wave really hit on this wave of conservatism of the 1920s, where they want to go back to before the Spanish flu, before World War I, before all the disruption of Red Summer, and go back. And that would be personified, this reaction to go back, with the Scopes monkey trial. At least I have that. Good. Yeah.
Page 15, the movement / nonviolence.
Okay, page 15, the movement, that's the civil rights movement. And a number of different groups. The one I gave you in class was the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. If you get the initials, you're fine. But the big one, that's the one that would be, Martin Luther King would be the head. And they would start this in Montgomery. So the movement. So Rosa Parks was part of the movement well before she gave up her seat. And this was going to be nonviolent civil disobedience to show how unjust the Jim Crow laws were. And the best examples would be, remember, the Freedom Riders and the sit-ins. Does those sound familiar to everybody? So that's the movement. But by the late 1960s, you start getting the black power, black consciousness, and it wasn't going fast enough. And don't forget the long haul signs. There's another one. Yes, Ben. Dr. Townsend on page 10. He won an old age pension because of the scourge, the problem of unemployment that was so big. Dr. Townsend would propose this old age pension, and he had Townsend clubs all over the country. It was much bigger than the U.S. could have afforded, but that would give Roosevelt cover to do a smaller but incredibly important pension plan called Social Security. So it pushed Roosevelt to do that. And that was opposition against Roosevelt from the left. Yes. Glass-Steagall on page 10 again. That would regulate banks and make sure that commercial and investment banks could not be unified. One of the most important laws in American history. But the biggest part would be, just if you get the initials, FDIC, and that's FDIC's deposit or insurance on deposits. So the bank run, it would alleviate the problem of bank runs. And so this would be a huge, this would make sure there'd be no bank panics there'd be no bank panics from 1933 until 2008. They repealed most of Glass-Steagall in 1999, and we had a bank panic. We've had two. So going around.
Iranian hostage crisis.
Iranian hostage crisis. That's
Page 14.
page 14. And what happened was, remember the U.S. overthrew the Iranian democracy back in 53. We put in the corrupt Shah of Iran in power. Well, there was an Islamic revolution in Iran in 1978. The Shah was overthrown. The Shah was overthrown. He fled. A religious government formed. It's complex what happened there. But the Shah actually got cancer. He came to the United States for treatment. And in Iran, they thought it's 53 all over again. They're going to overthrow the government. And so these just ginned up fundamentalist, zealous students stormed the U.S. Embassy, and they're going to hold 51 American hostages for 444 days in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the capital of Iran. And not only was it hell for the people being held, but it made President Carter look incredibly weak. It made it feel like we're losing the Cold War. It would be a major part of the conservative revival, without a doubt. Reagan made it very clear in the 1980 election. Carter can't even get the hostages home. What are the Soviets going to do? They would literally release the hostages the day Reagan was inaugurated to slap President Carter in the face. Yes. So what page? Page 15. Betty Friedan. So she wrote that book in 58, but that'd be a trigger of the women's rights movement. And that mystique that women should be perfectly satisfied, in fact, should want only a domestic life. And the big gist of that would be is that women need more choices, just like men do. And so the big areas this would push for would be for equal rights in the workplace, equal rights in education, which would happen with Title IX. One of the most important one, and will be on there, would be family planning, the pill, abortion rights. And then lastly, one that didn't pass the ERA. And that would not pass today. So, page 9, initiative and what? Initiative and private. You have to go?
Yeah.
You locked your keys in the car? Who in here has locked their keys in the car? Isn't that a pleasant feeling? It's a really pleasant feeling. I've done it. Oh, initiative. That's one of the progressive reforms, state level reform to get more direct democracy. And the primary system would be, instead of party leaders, voters would choose nominees for office. So voters would choose, your Republicans would vote, Democrats would vote, then they would be the person running. Did I put initiative? Initiative is the most famous of these. An initiative would be allowing for voters to initiate a bill and then let voters vote on it. And the whole idea was direct democracy, to get more people involved outside of political parties. And there's some good things and bad things about initiative and primaries, but for the most part, it didn't work the way the progressives thought. Voting went down. Yeah. Stagflation, page 14. That was a weird situation in the 1970s that you had high inflation and high unemployment. High inflation, and that shouldn't happen. And so all through the 70s, you had the situation where unemployment was too high, inflation was too high. Normally, if there's high inflation, if there's high unemployment, prices drop because people aren't buying stuff. And the big thing about this is it was because of oil prices. Oil prices went up dramatically. And then soon people just began to expect prices to go up all the time. Think about how much we had, a little bit of the prices in the last year have gone up. They've stabilized now, but remember last year how much prices were going up? Now imagine double that. That's what was at the end of the 1970s. And the big thing is this would people lose faith in liberal economics and help fuel conservative economics. Yeah. The long hot summers on 15, those were they also call them race riots, where expectations, especially in the urban north, weren't met by the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. They thought the Civil Rights Act would help, would change everything. but there's still incredibly high poverty, segregation, segregated cities. And so starting in like Watts, Newark, and this would help fuel kind of a backlash against the civil rights movement. Yes.
Afghanistan, end of detente.
End of detente, I know. I know. Page 50. Afghanistan, the end of detente. So, because of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the Soviet Union was fearful it would spread into the Soviet Union. And so they had a client state in Afghanistan. It was a client of the Soviets. This is in 1979. When they kicked the Soviet advisors out, the Soviet Union invaded it because they were fearful of that Islamic Revolution spreading. And this is going to lead to a horrific civil war that has lasted in Afghanistan until this day. And the United States would soon get involved by secretly sending weapons to mostly religious fundamentalist Sunni Muslims fighting against the Soviets. And we also helped recruit people from all over the Middle East to go fight the Soviets. And the Soviets would pull out in 86. I'm sorry, 88, and it would be a disastrous defeat for them. But when they invaded Afghanistan, that would end detente. The peace agreement would end. The U.S. boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. I mean, really bad. I should add that group of foreigners, they had a name. It was called the Base. Just the Base it's called, and the base in Arabic is Al Qaeda. And the United States would encourage Al Qaeda, including a guy named Osama bin Laden, who would later attack the United States. This is what we call blowback. Yeah. Or AKA a massive screw up. Chris. ERA. That was the attempt for the Equal Rights Amendment on page 15, ERA. And it immediately got 35 states, and so the assumption was no discrimination based upon sex would pass. But soon, opposition, mostly conservative, the idea that this would, no discrimination against women would disrupt the traditional family, and also big bathroom issues, kind of a moral panic. And this would become an issue for conservative Republicans to oppose. And so when Ronald Reagan was elected president, that pretty much killed off the ERA. So women still are not guaranteed equal rights under the Constitution. What's it? Oh, banks on page 12. That's one of the big reasons the United States entered World War I, is that American big banks had been buying British bonds, government bonds. And so the banks began to push the United States government to enter the war to make sure they get their money back. Now, this wasn't the only reason, but it was a big one. And that's part of the reason why the United States would be neutral for so long in the 1930s. We're not going to get sucked into another war for banks. Yes, Kevin.
Test ban on page 14.
Test ban on page 14. So that would be after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was an alleviation of the peace where they did a test ban and they quit open atmospheric tests. And then 20 years later, in the 1980s, would be a complete test ban that most countries in the world have signed. Test ban for nuclear weapons.
Okay.
And the whole idea was that's kind of like the first real instance of détente. Yes.
The WPA.
The WPA on page 10.
Yeah.
The biggest of all the New Deal program at the time was part of the second New Deal. And this was a massive public works program. Massive public works that would hire millions of workers to build roads, to build buildings, big dam building program. But they also they got actors' jobs, they provided daycare for women who are working, and one of the biggies, no discrimination based upon race and, to a limited degree, sex. I know that's still missing a lot of people, but that was still a pretty amazing thing. But this would build much of the infrastructure, public works that the United States still relies upon.
Wait, so why did it go away?
The war.
Oh.
The war ended, but not completely. Remember, Eisenhower made the interstate highway system? So that's kind of like a public work, just on the vast scale. And there was talk of doing that during the big crash in 2008, but that a lot of people propose that. Yeah. Okay, page 11, that's part of imperialism. And that was a justification that it was the duty of the superior race, white, to civilize and bring commerce to other people. And so this would be a justification for imperialism. And so that's part of the reason why the United States would like control Cuba. Even though we promised independence, we control it with the Platt Amendment saying they're not ready for independence. And don't forget, this was the most racist time. It's very much tied to a good place to put social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, white man's burden, social Darwinism, essentially the same thing. Yeah. What page again? It's the Platt Amendment, page 11. And this would be signed after the Spanish-American War ended, but it said that Cuba would remain a protectorate of the United States, where the United States could intervene in Cuban affairs anytime we want, basically if they're doing something against American business. And also we took a naval base, Guantanamo Bay. The Cubans are going to greatly resent this example of big stick diplomacy. Part of the reason why Castro would be so popular in Cuba by so many people, despite the fact he would be a pretty totalitarian dictator, but he stood up to America. So that was a big deal. Yes. Filipino insurrection, that would be the United States got the Philippines in the Treaty of Paris of 1898. Is that on there, Treaty of Paris? Or at least ending the Spanish-American War. The United States got the Philippines, but the Filipinos thought they were going to be independent. And so the United States is going to fight a brutal guerrilla war to hold on to the Philippines. And this would be, and the United States is going to end up doing many of the same tactics that they accused the Spanish of doing while we went to war with them, like waterboarding and concentration camps and torture. And finally, after this bloody war, the United States pulled back and agreed to give the Filipinos their independence in 1946. The United States got out of the colonial imperialism after this, and it was purely economic. How many have we covered? We've done a lot. Is this helping? We? No French. Yes. So JFK's military idea was called flexible response on page 13. And what it was is, unlike Eisenhower's new look, which was nuclear weapons, it would be flexible, as in nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, and counterinsurgency, like the Green Berets. And so it seemed like it was more flexible, but it's going to lead to a massive increase in defense spending, and this flexible response would help lead to American involvement in Vietnam. Actually, kind of a big heat up of the Cold War. Yes.
Page 13, Iran, 1953.
So Iran in 1953 on page 13. The United States overthrew a democracy in Britain. I'm sorry, in Iran after they nationalized British oil. British Petroleum basically stole with an unfair treaty. The U.S. overthrew this democracy and put in place a very brutal Shah. And most Americans did not know this. You got to go ahead? Okay, we'll see it. And most Americans did not know this. It would not come out to the 70s. But this is going to lead to massive repercussions down the road, like the Iran hostage crisis, Afghanistan, Iraq, 9/11. But this is one of the problems with the Cold War of using the CIA. No.
United Nations Security Council.
What page?
Same page.
Not 14? 13, I'm sorry. This would be created at Yalta after the war to replace the League of Nations. And it would be this kind of liberal idea where countries could come together and solve problems before they happen. But the Security Council had the most power in the United Nations, and 5 permanent members would have a veto, meaning that the United Nations had a very difficult time doing anything controversial. Like, for example, Ukraine right now, they can do nothing. You remember the permanent members, US, UK, Soviets, now Russia, China, France. Potsdam, that's the agreement in July, or that's the meeting of the big 3 in July of 1945. And Stalin kind of, at least to Truman's point of view, really kind of bullied him. But it would be at Potsdam, this is a biggie, that the United States said there'd be no reparations from Germany and infuriate the Soviets. The Soviets said no free elections in Eastern Europe, even though they promised them at Yalta. And the Soviets also agreed that 3 months after VE Day, Victory in Europe, oh no, that's Yalta, I'm sorry. I got confused. I'm getting old. At Potsdam, they issued the Potsdam Declaration. Now, the Soviets didn't do it because they weren't at war yet, but it basically said that Japan will face complete annihilation. Now, the Japanese ignored it, partially because they're already being destroyed by firebombs. But it would be at Potsdam where Truman would find out about the atomic bomb. You could argue that Potsdam was like the beginning of the Cold War. Yes, Rich. Oh, Dulles. Yeah. It's okay. So Dulles and massive retaliation on page 14. That was Eisenhower's foreign policy. Dulles was the Secretary of State. And basically Dulles promised a massive retaliation with nuclear weapons, and the program was called brinksmanship. We'll go to the very brink of nuclear war. And so we promised full-scale nuclear war if you don't do what we want. It sounded good for domestic politics. It sounded tough. But places like Hungary and other places showed that it was a complete failure. It actually made the world much more dangerous, as we'll soon see the Cuban Missile Test. Yeah. Marshall Plan on page. This is under the Truman administration, massive U.S. aid to Western Europe and also indirectly Japan. So the United States will help rebuild, including the countries we fought. Help rebuild them after World War II so they would not go to communism or fascism. And it would be remarkably successful, not just in Europe and Japan of rebuilding their economy. Some might argue almost too good, but also they bought a bunch of stuff in the US. This is a good example of liberal foreign policy. And you may, yes. Reaganomics on page, the 90s page. And that's Reagan's supply side economics. That's or trickle down. Supply side or trickle down. And Reagan's plan was massive cuts in taxes and massive cuts in domestic spending. And that would get rid of the deficit because it would the wealthy would take their big tax cuts and build factories. And it did the exact opposite. They did not build factories. They speculated in the stock market, and the deficit actually went up dramatically. They did dramatically cut school lunches and aid to education. Actually, we should have one big thing on Reaganomics because this will directly affect all of you if you plan to pay for college. Once Reaganomics came in, the cost of college, that's when it starts going up. It starts going up dramatically. I was not really. You'll notice it much more. Yes. So Mikhail Gorbachev became the new leader of the Soviet Union in 1985, and he was trying to reform the Soviet Union, like Khrushchev tried to save it. And so he initiated a series of arms control talks with Reagan. And Reagan was pretty scared. When Reagan found out that we almost blew the world up in '83, he was a little nervous. Reagan found out in 1983 that nuclear war was bad. You think I'm joking? I'm not joking. He thought nuclear war wouldn't be that bad.
Just like a little toddler playing with nukes.
I'm not making that up. And so Gorbachev started initiating arms control agreements. and there would be a couple big ones. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces, just called the INF, for weapons in Europe. And then the biggie, it would be the year after Reagan left, START, which is Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. And these talks that Reagan would actually, for the most part, kind of agree to, were the first real nuclear arms limitation, but Gorbachev's reforms would blow up the Soviet Union. It led to all this dissent. And so that's the last thing you got to get. I should add that conservatives were furious with Reagan. They thought they loved Reagan, and then they were hating him. That's forgotten by a lot of people. Yeah. Yes. A couple more, and then we'll take a break real quick, and then I'll do a few more. Sound good?
Okay, page 14, I don't even want to try this.
Okay.
Um,
Point it out. Oh, near the top of page 14, Dien Bien Phu in Geneva. Dien Bien Phu in 54, that's when the French were kicked out of French Indochina. And Eisenhower actually wanted to go help, like including nuclear weapons. But when the French lost there, the French would agree to the Geneva Accords. So they gave up their colony of French Indochina, but that would set up two Vietnams, North and South. And the US commits South Vietnam to not unify. So did not agree to the Geneva Accords that they all signed to. And when that happened, that would be the beginning of the Vietnam War. And the US wanting two Vietnams. One more after this time.
On the square deal.
Square deal on page 10, 9, 8, 9, 6.
9.
What?
9.
Page 9, square deal. That was Harry Truman, sorry, not Harry Truman. That was Teddy Roosevelt's 1904 progressive platform. And the big thing he wanted on there would be regulation. Regulation of trust, regulation of business. And also a progressive income tax. And end child labor laws. And women's right to vote. And so these would be the big progressive reforms. We can go through more, but those are the biggest. And not that they would happen. Oh, one more thing I almost forgot, and conservation of the environment. Conservation of the environment. And not quite environmentalism, that word didn't exist yet. Only in environmentalism did he really get in of what he wanted. But some of these reforms would happen under Woodrow Wilson and then FDR. Quick break, 5-minute break. And you got a few, and if you got, I mean, still, it doesn't mean you shouldn't look at it. And the bowls, I mean, it's a little bit over half. I thought that was a pretty fair. We need a drink.
Oh, let me unstick real fast.
Yes, go. See you.
What about?
Huh? It did. Walk out and I think you're getting locked. You're kidding. You got off. You're fine.
I'm like, do you want me to like? It was this cool.
For the ones who got together. Yeah.
So I didn't have this. There's some debate about it, like,
Yeah. Like you were
You got
set
one.
to wait.
We got
Like
one.
not like you're like after but like you're like on the
You have to go, Dad?
Yeah.
See ya. I don't know how much longer to go, but I'll cover a few more. I think we're getting a lot done. 45, that's a lot.
Got my sister.
Now you have to show me.
Keeping funny.
Yeah, where did you go? That's pretty funny. No,
Okay, bye guys.
when we were in New York City, I was gonna go with my wife, but then we ended up, she went with her. I wanted to go. I wanted to go, but then somebody had tickets to the Yankees. And also, but I know, I have watched it on TV. The problem is it's just so inaccurate. But, oh, I know, but I can't get past that. Huh? No. But everyone tells me to. I know I probably should. Well, we only had practice out there today. What time is it? Let's do a few more. We'll see how we're doing. I think I like it. I wonder if I could check the score of the basketball game. Let me get a drink and then. Who's working on a float tomorrow? Who's going to be in the band after March? Awesome. So if I were you, I just stay up all night Thursday night. Just stay up. Do not do that. Get up at least an hour before the test, everybody. I'm looking at you, John. You want to go over some? Let's finish up a few more, then I'll go. If you have more, do you guys still want some more? Okay, I'll go through some. Now I'm hungry. You have to go? Bye. Okay, I'll go through a few more, then we'll go.
Little Rock, 1957.
What page?
15.
Little Rock, 1957. That would be the first school the former Confederacy desegregated after the war.
Mr. Parker, do you need any help?
No.
Oh, okay.
There's nothing I can do. It broke. There were no screws in that. It was just sitting there. It was just leaned up literally in that.
We're not allowed to
Huh?
We're not allowed to throw that door open and
Thanks for telling me.
I figured that you're like an authority.
No, I have no authority. All right, so what was the question? Little Rock. So the first school that was desegregated, and they did Little Rock Central High on purpose because it was a working class white school, and that would get that kind of class racial resentment. And Governor Earl Faubus of Arkansas would send out the National Guard to stop the integration of just 8 students or 9 students. But President Eisenhower was furious, and even though he was no friend to civil rights, he would send in the 101st Airborne Division, so he'd send in troops. Eisenhower would send in troops to enforce the court ruling and force integration. And this would be a big example how the federal government is behind integration, but Faubus would be reelected 8 more times after this. You can see the beginning of the Southern strategy. That Southern strategy you should know. Yes.
Now on page.
Now it's a national organization of women. And it was a group started by Betty Friedan. And the big thing on page 15, the big things they wanted: education, jobs, job security, and family planning. And they had great success at first. Now it's a big organization, but they faded in the 1970s. Let's get 14 again? 13. 15. Civil Rights Act of 64, that would be passed, it's kind of pushed through by Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson. And Northern Democrats and liberal Republicans voted for it over a Southern filibuster. And this would say no discrimination based upon race or sex, thus ending at least most of Jim Crow. Arguably one of the most important laws in American history. And it was based upon the 14th Amendment. Yes.
American Indian movement.
The American Indian movement, that was the movement for more rights on American Indian reservations that were, especially during the Eisenhower administration, were essentially second-class citizens. The poverty rate was over 50% in reservations. And remember the Dawes Act, 50%. And so this is a movement for equal rights on the reservations. And to get people to notice, they would actually hold out and occupy the battlefields of Wounded Knee for that battle in 1890. And also the now abandoned prison of Alcatraz for a year to try to get people to notice the plight of American Indians. Yes. Populist Party in Omaha, page 9. And that was a reaction to the fact that mostly farmers, but working people felt that they were being ignored. No Sherman Antitrust Act. Sherman Antitrust Act was worthless. They didn't do ICC didn't do anything about railroads. And so they had it in 1892, they met in Omaha. And this was the populist, it was called the People's Party, but everyone called them the Populist Party as an alternative to the Democrats and the Republicans. And their big things were they wanted to reform capitalism, to save capitalism, much like FDR. FDR was a populist in many ways. And their big things would be like progressive income tax, regulation of business, even government ownership of the most important businesses like railroads, direct election of senators, women's rights, civil rights. But their whole goal was to reform capitalism. And they be kind of rolled into the William Jennings Bryan and the Democratic Party. Yes. Page 15? Okay, that's the ruling that would say that separate but equal schools, public schools, were inherently unequal because of the reason they're separate, which is racism. And so that would begin the process of integrating some public schools, but it's going to take a very long time. And there'd be a big backlash, especially in the South. They set up segregation academies, private schools for whites only. So obviously a very important ruling, but yes.
Hill on page 15.
Hill?
Hill.
Oh, pill, the birth control. The birth control, and this would be on page 14 or 15?
15.
And this was the lifelong goal of Margaret Sanger, who would start Planned Parenthood. And this was to give women more independence over their own body so they could decide family planning. And so it's a big economic issue. Decide family planning so they could, women could prepare for children, families could prepare. And there's nothing more important towards at least any achievements for women towards equality than the PET. So this has become the cornerstone of the women's rights movement. And that relates to Gifford versus, or Connecticut versus Griswold, that would offer privacy rights. Yes.
Space race,
Space race page
16.
16. The space race became a big ticket of the Cold War, where the United States versus the Soviet Union. It was kind of triggered by Sputnik, but the big goal was to go to the moon. And the United States government would do a massive effort through NASA to get to the moon first. The Soviets actually were close, but they ended up spending every penny they had on nuclear weapons and the military after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the U.S. won the space race and got to the moon in 1969, Apollo 11. Yes, Gabe. Emmett Till, page 15. He was lynched. He was a 13-year-old boy lynched in Chicago, or lynched in Mississippi. He was from Chicago. He was there visiting relatives. And supposedly he said something to a woman. He was lynched. His accusers were acquitted in the court. But the big reason we have to know Emmett Till was in 1953, a lynching like that couldn't be hidden anymore because of the modern media, television. And so the whole country had to see what was really happening in the South. It wasn't hidden. And this would be a catalyst for the movement. Emmett Till was like, we have to do something. It's no coincidence that you're going to have the Montgomery bus boycott right after that. Yeah.
Cesar Chavez and that
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. On what page?
15.
Cesar Chavez he worked to try to unionize migrant farm workers. Many of them were Mexican immigrants in the 1970s who were paid almost slave-like wages and were treated like indentured servants. So he tried to unionize them, and there would be a small effort for union and a small increase in wages. But for the migrant workers, it hasn't changed. It's better, but still not very difficult conditions. Is there another one? Oh, you might see Hispanic. This happened 2 years ago on the test. There was a term for the 1970s for someone Hispanic, and it's just so weird. It just went out of fashion, but it was called Chicano. And Chicano means Hispanic. I don't know if they'll say it. It totally, the late 1970s just like totally disappeared from the lexicon. Yeah.
Short khaki,
On page
11.
that was FDR's plan in his second term to put up to 6 Supreme Court justices on to make sure that the conservative Supreme Court won't overturn Social Security or the Wagner Act. Now, it failed, and it would be a big political defeat for Roosevelt. But it did kind of cow the Supreme Court, who did approve the Wagner Act and Social Security. They got a little nervous. Any others? Yes.
Keynesian economics.
Keynesian economics, that's 1930s. That's after John Maynard Keynes. That's liberal economics or demand side. And the whole goal of theirs, government should try to promote workers, get more money into workers' hands. That will increase demand. door, got to figure it out. That will increase demand, and that will increase employment, and that's how you get the economy going again. And Roosevelt would finally fully go to that with a massive increase in the WPA in 38. The world, much at least the Western world, Western Europe, Japan, and the United States, Canada, would be Keynesian up into the late 1970s. Oh, and one thing about Keynesian economics, that'll lead to the Great Compression. Yes. So legacy of the New Deal, page 11. The legacy of the New Deal was a few things. First off, one of the biggest is the Great Compression. For 40 years, the gap between the rich and the poor shrunk. Also, unprecedented financial stability. There were no financial panics for 70 years until they overturned Glass-Steagall. And the idea that the United States is a middle-class country. That came out of the New Deal. This middle-class country. And that we expect the government to act after the New Deal. We expect the government to act. Oh, one more thing, and the Democrats would control Congress until the 1990s, kind of that New Deal coalition, until a Democrat would post for NAFTA. Page 11, Boxer Rebellion, that's in 1900, and that was a rebellion in China, rebellion in China against foreign influence and unfair treaties. All the great powers, including the United States, would put down the rebellion. And China would be humiliated. And this would lead to the open door, where all the great powers can equally exploit China. The open door. And the big thing about that one was two things. First off, Japan would violate the open door in the 30s, helping lead to that World War II in the Pacific. And China has never forgotten that. To this day. Page 14?
15.
Page 15. The Tet Offensive in 1968, that was a massive attack, surprise attack by the, page 14. A massive attack by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese all over South Vietnam to trigger an uprising. It failed miserably. The Viet Cong would be devastated by this. But Johnson had been saying there's light at the end of the tunnel. We're almost won. And nobody believed him after that. How could they attack everywhere if they're almost defeated? And public opinion would turn against the war in the United States. And with that, Johnson would drop out of the race, which was a shock to everybody, and would lead to the beginnings of the end of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and the election of Richard Nixon. Yes, Nick.
Roosevelt corollary.
Roosevelt correlate, same page, or was that, no, back to 11? Roosevelt corollary was issued by Franklin Roosevelt after the bank crisis in the Dominican Republic, where the U.S. took over the banks. And it was a Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine that said the United States will act as a police force to intervene all over the Western Hemisphere. And this would be the doctrine that would set up big stick diplomacy, economic imperialism of Latin America. Yeah.
So with the Paris peace talks, why didn't Nixon want the war to end?
Because if the war ended, it would, and he was a Republican, it would help his Democratic opponent, Hubert Humphrey, who was LBJ's vice president. So if LBJ negotiated a peace, Hubert Humphrey would bask in that glory. So he wanted to win an election. And the election was razor thin. It was really close. So it would have only taken about 70,000 votes in a couple states. A few more? Or are you done? A few more, yeah.
Unions/CIO.
So unions on page 11.
Yeah.
That's the growth of labor unions after the Wagner Act. Eventually, over 30% of all workers would be members of the union. That's a big part of the Great Compression. And the most important of these unions would be the CIO, which was a big industrial union of all workers. Like, for example, the United Auto Workers were CIO. Ready, Jack Randall. Treaty of Versailles would, on page 12 would end World War I. And Wilson went there with this very hopeful 14 points, even though they're unrealistic. But none of that would happen. So everyone's going to be disappointed in the treaty. And the big thing is the big three, Britain, France, and the United States, they're going to make Germany take blame for the war. And Germany will lose their colonies, pay a huge reparations, and lose much of their army. Now, the thought was, so Germany can't do it again. But this is going to lead to massive resentment in Germany and help fuel right-wing parties, most famously the National Socialists. So that's the Treaty of Versailles. Lend-Lease on page 12 was passed in 1941. And even though the United States was still neutral in World War II, it said the U.S. would give weapons to countries fighting aggression, meaning fighting the Axis. And we would give billions to Britain, to the Soviet Union, to win the war. And it was worth every penny. So we won't have the big loan issue like we had after World War I. Tyson.
Fair Labor Standards Act.
That would be the last of the major New Deal laws, on page 11.
Yeah.
1938, and that's the one that set minimum wage, 40-hour work week, no child labor. And it passes the Constitution. I should add, there's states all over getting rid of child labor law, so rolling back. We're going back to the 20s. Fair Labor Standards Act, 1938. Someone had their hand up over here. Yeah. Okay, the ratification battle, that's ratification of the Treaty of Versailles because it needs 2/3 of the Senate. We did a DPQ on that. Remember, that's the one with the reservationists wanted some change in Article 10. Remember, that's the collective security one. Does that sound familiar to everybody? Do you have bad dreams about that now? Okay. Article 10, we said collective security. So they were mad about the League of Nations. Reservations wanted to change. Irreconcilables were conservatives who wanted no treaty at all. And then loyal Democrats behind Wilson. But Wilson was unwilling to make reservations, to agree to them, and the treaty never was signed. So the U.S. never joined the League of Nations and would become isolationists in the 1920s. I mean, not totally like we built a wall, but we kind of did, the National Origins Act. But that's the ratification battle. So more conservative forces won there. Kind of fit in that conservative revival of the 20s. Any more? One more? Does everyone want more? Is there one more you have to get? Yeah, I'll get two more. I'll get you. Yeah.
Office of Price Administration on page 12.
The Office of Price Administration. They're the ones in World War II on page 12. Office of Price Administration, the OPA. They rationed rare items in World War II and put price controls to try to control inflation during World War II. And they did a really good job. Not saying there weren't problems, but inflation was not near as bad in World War II as World War I. So by setting price and wage controls and rationing goods. And if you're talking about World War II, like my dad still talks about chocolate. They ration chocolate. Where are you going to get chocolate from? Chocolate? Let's talk chocolate. Pearl Harbor, back to chocolate. I'm kind of like dark chocolate now. Yeah, I used to like only milk chocolate, but now I like dark chocolate. Did that answer your question? So Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And the reason is because the U.S. embargoed oil to Japan after they took French Indochina. The U.S. embargoed oil. And Japan, they were not going to, so the Japanese were not going to give up China or Indochina. Do you remember Bushido, the Code of the Samurai? We're not going to give in. We're not going to back down. And so they decided we're going to get our own oil in the Dutch East Indies. But to make sure the U.S. won't get in the way, they thought they could knock out the American Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor, the colony there, and the U.S. would back down. So that's why they attacked at Pearl Harbor. The attack was partially successful. They did sink a few battleships, but the U.S. was furious, wanted revenge, and would plunge the United States into war. Add one more thing into Pearl Harbor. For reasons that nobody can really explain, except for the fact that he was kind of a drug-addled lunatic, Hitler declared war on the United States, and that's how we got in the war with Germany after Pearl Harbor. 3 days after, that's how we got it. Are we good? Does anyone want any other one? We covered a lot. Does that help? And even if you had those stuff down, isn't it good just to hear it again and review it and go through it? All right. Good. I gotta stop recording. Stop recording and transcription. Yes.